You are listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 24th of December 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Broadcasting from Midori House in London, this is a special edition of The Globalist, and I'm Cermak. Coming up, a look at the year that was in the world of elections and politics. Nina dos Santos joins to discuss how Europe will react to Trump 2.0.
Chris, that is a multi-trillion-dollar question. If 2022 and 2023 were years when we saw war break out, it's likely that 2025 is going to be a year of the return of the trade war, thanks to Donald Trump.
More on that shortly. From there, we head to Japan and a new prime minister who will have to prove he has staying power in the coming year. We'll also look at the disputed elections and lurches from left to right in Latin America. And finally,
as long as you pay taxes, as long as you didn't rebel against the Ottoman Empire, you could practice whatever religion, whatever beliefs you had. And this changed.
Yossi Meckelberg reflects on a year like few before in the Middle East. That's all up ahead on a special edition of The Globalist from Midori House in London. Welcome to The Globalist. It has been the biggest year of elections ever seen, capped with perhaps one of the most consequential results of our time in the decisive election of Donald Trump in the United States. Now, considering that Trump permeates almost every conversation as it is, we are not going to tackle Trump head-on with today's show. Instead, we'll be exploring different regions of the world that have been impacted by the upheaval of this past year in politics, and we will start with Europe. For that, I'm joined by Nina dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and former CNN Europe editor. Nina, happy Christmas Eve to you.
And happy future new year to you, Chris. They're going to keep us busy, isn't it?
It's going to keep us busy. The last year kept us extremely busy. It is not going to let up for us as journalists. I will say, though, that, well, I don't know, with Trump 2.0 coming, when you look even at Europe and sort of reactions that are coming in here, is there... What do you make of it this time around? I mean, I feel like there's a certain amount of fatigue, but there's also a sort of determination among governments, even here, to really just kind of hit the ground running and I guess accept the result this time in a way that maybe they didn't in 2016.
Yeah, that's right. They realise that they've got to get their ducks in order because economically it's going to be a tsunami coming their way, particularly with regards to Europe, because Europe is one of those clubs that Donald Trump has earmarked for double-digit trade tariffs. So he wants to impose tariffs of about 10% on goods coming from one of America's biggest trading partners, one of the biggest blocks of consumers anywhere in the world. Okay, 10% isn't quite as bad as the 25% that have been earmarked for places like Canada, Mexico, and China and so on and so forth. But it's still going to be a huge upheaval for the EU at a time when the Franco-German axis that usually directs Europe in difficult times, those two biggest economies that have the most political heft inside the EU, well, that axis is wobbling severely. We've got elections coming up in February in Germany that look like we're going to see a new party in charge, the Christian Democrats, albeit without a majority government. And also, who knows where France will be, whether or not it'll still have a government come the first few days of 2025.
Well, and we will get to some of those. But when it comes to, as you mentioned, this pending trade war, I think maybe what's interesting is, as you mentioned, this shift from wars to a trade war. If in order for that to happen, Donald Trump would have to follow through on his promise to end the wars first. What do we expect from that? He has said he wants to end the war in Ukraine famously on day one. There has been a pretty incredible shift in rhetoric here too, also from Ukraine, sort of this recognition that this war needs to end in a way that perhaps they would not have said before Trump was elected. Can they actually do it?
Well, that's a big question. Donald Trump appeared to suggest that actually upon election, within 24 hours, he'd have been able to convince President Zelensky of Ukraine and President Putin of Russia that it was time to call it a day. But obviously that hasn't happened yet. But it could happen within the first few days of Donald Trump's presidency, largely because we're already seeing, as you were pointing out before, a big change in the stance of President Zelensky of Ukraine. It was just a couple of months ago that he hit the United Nations General Assembly, you remember, at the end of, I think, September it was, with a victory plan, one that he said would put Ukraine on a sure footing to be able to negotiate from a strong position. Partly the problem with that plan was that it included a lot of demands that were also viewed as unfeasible by the international community backing Ukraine. Then we've had talk of a peace plan, and now we hear that Zelensky recognises that he's going to have to give up some territory like Crimea and Donbass in any future deal. He, in fact, just gave an interview to Le Monde, I think it was, the French newspaper, just in the last few days ahead of Christmas, acknowledging that. So we're seeing a big change in stance, largely from Zelensky, not so much clearly from Vladimir Putin.
And what about from Europe? Because that is the other question, isn't it? Whatever kind of deal might be made here, it does have big implications for European security. That is, in effect, what this has always been about, hasn't it? This has been at least the argument of European governments, that what happens in Ukraine affects us all. Do we get the sense that Europe is ready to pick up the pieces from whatever deal is made in Ukraine?
Well, you mentioned the pieces. I would actually argue that, and I know it's been said before many times on these airwaves, that obviously the peace dividend that was ushered in when we saw the end of the Cold War was abruptly shattered, wasn't it, upon the invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. And since then, nobody really knows where the new future axis of security, the fault line, will eventually settle. So the question is, if we see territories of Ukraine being surrendered, albeit in a temporary fashion, to Russia, freezing that conflict somewhere near, maybe say Kherson in Ukraine, will that be the new sort of Berlin Wall, if you like, between East and West? Will that completely re-engineer the security architecture in this part of the world? Places like Poland are very aware of this. Places like Germany are increasingly having to get up to speed with it, despite a lot of denial in the past. So Europe is aware that it needs to spend more to defend itself, and partly defending itself will be picking up where perhaps the United States recuses and removes itself under Donald Trump to help Ukraine defend whatever border we see in eastern Ukraine from here.
You did mention Germany in there, and that, of course, is the big election that will be coming up in 2025, early 2025. And to your points about Ukraine and European security, it will be interesting. I mean, this election, it does feel like, is pretty much a done deal at this point for the Christian Democrats and Friedrich Merz, who has been very hawkish on Ukraine. He's been very aggressive about talking about beefing up the German military, the German Bundeswehr. Germany hasn't been a particularly strong leader over these last few years under Olaf Scholz. Neither has France, for that matter, but that's a subject for a whole other question. Do we get the sense that Germany could maybe be back in some way under someone like Friedrich Merz?
I suppose it depends on who he governs with, because the polls are indicating ahead of this election that his party would get the lion's share of the votes, sort of over a third of the votes, but that's not an absolute majority. And the second party that could get the next share of the votes would be the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, which is the far-right party that, of course, the CDU doesn't want to work with. Exactly. So could we end up seeing Scholz being back in government, albeit as a junior partner? Would that temper Friedrich Merz's attempts to try and make sure that Germany does lead from the front and not from behind on issues of security? Because as you pointed out, yes, Scholz's unpopular coalition, which wasn't just his own politics. He also had other coalition partners like, for instance, the Greens, who weren't particularly comfortable in some cases with, changing Germany's historic pacifist stance on its foreign policy and defence policy. Will they be back to temper a little bit Friedrich Merz if he has to rely upon them to form a coalition? But you're right. Anybody from outside of Germany watching all of this will have been thinking, why didn't Scholz give Ukraine the Taurus long-range missiles, when eventually everybody else capitulated and gave Ukraine the right to strike inside Russian territory, to take out those sort of sites from which they were launching attacks inside Russia. Why didn't Germany do more? And I think that a lot of military strategists will be looking at that in the past and having a think about where Olaf Scholz might have gone wrong, even if he did say early into his time that wir leben in Zeitenwende. We live in changing times. He appeared to embrace that new security dynamic, but he sort of faltered at the last stage, being rather ambiguous about it.
Just finally, Nina, as you've done a lot of work in Brussels as well, I wonder if you've sensed there that there's sort of power dynamics shifting when you look at Germany's weakness, France's political indecision as well. There is a new government in Brussels as well under von der Leyen, or, Brussels, von der Leyen 2.0, I suppose, as well. But do you get the sense that what she has to do, where Brussels is looking, are they also looking more towards Eastern EU nations than they are maybe to that traditional Franco-German axis?
Yeah, you're right. I think they definitely are. One of the indications of that is the fact that you've got the former Estonian Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, in charge of foreign affairs as the High Representative, essentially stewarding all of the EU's big foreign affairs projects. Traditionally, that had gone to, Spaniards, Italians, those sort of southern and western European nations that had been, involved with the European project for a lot longer than the Baltic states that joined upon accession during the Lisbon Treaty. And so giving that job to somebody from the Baltic countries who's been quite vocal about the threat from Russia also goes to show that there's a new security dynamic. Those Baltic countries have been given a bigger voice on the stage also in the form of Kubilius, who's been given the brief for defence. So now the EU has a new defence commissioner that's in charge of a big fund to procure and scale up defence manufacturing for this part of the world, again reflecting that security dynamic. But just going back to the German power, it is still very much there in Ursula von der Leyen. Now, Ursula von der Leyen, in her second term, the thing you read and hear time and time again from the Brussels press pack is that she's got more and more control than ever, and that she's also centralised her control with a very clear vision. It's amazing to think that this was not originally the Spitzenkandidat a few years ago in her first term. Everybody assumed that job would go to the centre-right EPP head, Martin Weber, and at the end of the day, she was ushered in at the last minute, I think by Emmanuel Macron actually, as a sort of candidate that nobody expected. Then a lot of people assumed she might not be up to the job because there were a lot of concerns about her time as German defence minister that appeared to be quite underwhelming. But boy, has she risen to the challenge in her first term, and now she's really taken the reins of power. Whether that's got a lot to do with her being German or not, and the security dynamic that Europe faces, who knows? But she's certainly more powerful, even if her country and France isn't necessarily in this new world.
It is Ursula von der Leyen's world in Brussels. Nina dos Santos, thank you very much for joining us on this special Globalist. This is The Globalist, and I'm Chris Cermak. The year of elections has extended from the US to France, from India to Japan, which is where we head to next, because I'm joined right here in the studio by Monocle's Tokyo Bureau Chief, Fiona Wilson. Fiona, Merry Christmas Eve.
Thank you very much. What a way to spend Christmas Eve, talking about Japanese politics. What else would we be doing?
What else would we possibly be doing on Christmas Eve? Nothing else going on in the world. We want to talk about Japan. It's been an unusually exciting year in Japanese politics.
Yes, us Japan watchers have had a thrilling ride. I mean, it's true that generally Japanese politics is so stable to the point of dullness. We've had one party just dominating post-war politics, the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP. Every prime minister you can remember was an LDP prime minister. We had a bit of a trauma for the LDP in the autumn when the new prime minister, Shigeru Ishiba, he'd just become the leader of the party and announced a general election with no notice at all, great shock to the party, and managed to lose the party's supermajority with its coalition party, Komeito. So that was a big trauma for the party and for the country. And he's trying to rule Japan as a minority government, which traditionally has not gone very well. So we'll see.
Well, and I want to get to the idea of a minority government. But first, what do you make then of Shigeru Ishiba? Because on the one hand, yes, he's surprised people. He's lost his majority, but one could also say he seems to be somebody who nevertheless manages to hang on.
No, that's very, very true.
Slightly charitably.
Look, he tried. It was the fifth time of asking that he became Prime Minister. I mean, he's an absolute veteran, and he's been a thorn in the side of many a Japanese Prime Minister. I would say he's a very natural kind of opposition person within the party. He's been the person who's raised his hand and said, ask questions. He's considered rather awkward personally, and within the party, within that sort of parliamentary party, he's considered very difficult. Not that well liked, I have to say. His grassroots support was always stronger. He was popular with the public and the grassroots of the LDP. The party itself found him just rather difficult. He left the party briefly, which didn't go down well. Some people have not forgiven him. And I think that's been his challenge. Actually getting power was a bit of a shock for him, I think.
And tell us a bit more, though, about why, by contrast, he's popular with the grassroots. What is it about him that makes him succeed with the voting public? Although he did lose the election, that said.
Yeah, I think that was the shock, because he had always been seen as this popular politician. And he was always, when the party was polled, the public choice was always Ishiba was either first, usually first, sometimes second, but he was always right up there. And yeah, I think it's a bit of a shock for him. But I think, it's been a difficult time for the LDP. I don't think in the election he was being punished personally. People were fed up with the politics of the LDP. They'd had this scandal about fundraising, and at a time when people are very worried about their own incomes, they were furious that politicians were trousering a bit of money for themselves and not really explaining themselves. And I think Fumio Kishida, the previous Prime Minister, had to go. His polling was so bad by the end, there was no way he could continue. But I think that Ishiba really suffered. That was a hangover from that period. But actually, as it's turned out, I think he struggled to translate being this opposition voice within the party to really having power. Now, he's coming to the end of the year with better polling, I have to say. His rating has gone up. So it might be a good end to the year. It looked so bad for him in October, but I think it's a slightly brighter new year.
Slightly brighter. And where does that come from in your mind, particularly because of the fact that getting to this idea of a minority government, it's not an easy position to be in. It's not an easy position for any country to have. How does this work in Japan? What has he made of it so far?
Yeah, I think he's steadying the ship. I think that was the point. It looked so rocky. People were really concerned. This idea of a minority government, it just doesn't go down well. I think what happened with him was that the parties he was trying to make another coalition with, to get to the 233 seats he needed to get a majority within the Diet, he was going to have to cozy up with parties he really fundamentally didn't agree with. It was very, very difficult. And they were publicly playing both sides. Maybe they were going to go with the opposition party. Maybe they were going to go with Ishiba. And I think in the end, the stability was more with the LDP. And if he can, limp through, he may make it. I think his challenge also is on the foreign front. He is not a brilliant diplomat, it turns out. And he was seen at the G20. There were some pretty unfortunate photos of him looking a bit disinterested. Leaders were coming to greet him, and the Japanese public was slightly embarrassed. He didn't even get up out of his seat. He would sort of look up, shake his hand, and then, maybe he would go back to whatever he was doing. And I think he's not a smooth operator on that front. I don't think it's a surprise. That's been his thing. He's a slightly contrary person, quite an unusual person, I would say. And he's not doing the obvious diplomacy. So he's going to have challenges, and obviously the regional challenges are massive for him. And then you've got a Trump presidency looming, and I think that's also going to be another challenge. There's no sign that he's going to have any personal chemistry with Donald Trump at this point.
This despite the fact, as we've often talked about on Monocle Radio shows, the fact that Shinzo Abe did have a very good, strong personal relationship with Donald Trump. Do you imagine that there might be any perhaps goodwill from Trump that perhaps Shigeru Ishiba can pick up on when he tries to deal with Trump in his somewhat more awkward manner?
I think we know the answer to that. That would be a no. I mean, unless Ishiba suddenly becomes a very keen golfer, which Shinzo Abe was, and did play golf with Donald Trump. Yeah, I don't think Ishiba's that kind of person. Now, Shinzo Abe, he was a little bit awkward in terms of his English language ability, maybe, but he really understood the optics of it. He knew he needed...
And they spoke on the phone for hours, I believe, at various points.
Apparently, this was the case. Hard to believe, but I'd love to have been a fly on the wall in those conversations. But no, this is a hugely important alliance. It's the most important alliance in Asia. They need to get along nicely. And I think the previous presidency, when Donald Trump was president the previous time, it was very difficult for Japan because he was saying publicly, Japan's not paying enough to host our troops. Of course, it pays a huge amount. But it was a very strange time, to say nothing of the economic stress of Trump threatening these huge tariffs on China, which will impact Japan as well. And I think the whole region is bracing itself for the economic impact of a Donald Trump presidency.
Well, Fiona, we will let you get on with your Christmas celebrations. What does Christmas look like in Japan for you?
You know, Christmas Day is a working day in Japan. It's not a holiday, so it will be a day like any other.
Business as usual.
Business as usual.
Business as usual. Fiona Wilson of Monocle in Tokyo. Thank you very much for joining us. This is The Globalist. You are back with The Globalist. I'm Chris Cermak. Latin America is a continent that has seen a number of upheavals of its own this year, from the experiment that is Javier Milei in Argentina to an election in Venezuela. Election being, well, questionable how one uses that word, and ending with questions about Brazilian President Lula's health and fitness for office. Well, Andrew Thompson is a journalist and political risk analyst specializing in Latin America and joins us now. Andrew, I wanted to start with Argentina, I suppose, could sort of start at the beginning of the year, because Milei came into office just at the end of last year. What do we make of his sort of 1-year anniversary, as it were?
I think by any standards, we have to chalk it down as quite a successful first year. Milei is a man of the far right, very, very interested in economic theory, and an ultra-monetarist. What he's achieved is something that previous governments of both left and right have failed to do, which is to reduce the fiscal deficit. He's actually pushed Argentina into a fiscal surplus, which has helped reduce an inflation rate that was 25% a month. It's now been brought down to about 2% a month. But it's been brought down at enormous cost. Argentina is quite a sort of sophisticated welfare society, and the reduction in the fiscal deficit has been achieved by 30-40% decreases in the real purchasing power of the minimum wage, of pensions, of state employee payments. So the surprising thing, perhaps, is that after a year of savage cuts, Milei still has an approval rating of around 50%, which is pretty high given the general context. And the issue for him is whether he can keep these improvements going ahead of midterm elections, which happen in October 2025, October next year.
It is quite incredible the way you describe that, Andrew, that he remains popular despite the cost of the prescriptions, even if, as you suggest, they have worked at a time where nothing else seemed to work to help Argentina's economy. I mean, given that, I do wonder if you feel like this is something that could be replicated elsewhere in Latin America, which has tended to have more left-wing rather than right-wing governments, at least more recently. I mean, is there, a chance that his kind of model could come to other places if he's successful?
I think people would probably acknowledge that Argentina's economic problems are particularly dramatic, and a lot of other countries have similar problems but less intense. So the kind of approach, you need to tailor it to different conditions in different countries. And you have, interestingly, not all governments of the left create massive deficits, and not all governments of the right create big surpluses. It's more complicated than that. But I think what Milei will do is basically remind the rest of Latin America that there are benefits from balancing your budget in terms of reducing inflation.
Well, to that point as well, I suppose, if we look at one other country that may at some point in the future be lurching once again to the right, that could be Brazil, because President Lula has been he's had some medical issues over the last month or so. It does call into question a little bit his fitness for office. There will be an election not this coming year, but the following year in Brazil. Is Brazil in danger of going in the sort of back in the far right direction, perhaps going the way of the United States?
I think there is a real danger, but there's a question mark over whether it will go in a far right direction or in a center right direction. I think one of the key issues is that Lula, who is now in his third presidential term and may be in the running for a fourth presidential term in the 2026 elections, he is an exceptional politician. He's basically a left-winger who is presiding over a center-left government who is getting laws passed by a center-right Congress. So Lula is, in his essence, he's a very, very skilled negotiator. And if he disappears from the Brazilian scene, there will be something of a deficit, of a political gap there. What I was saying earlier, the far right is represented by former President Jair Bolsonaro, who is excluded. He's been accused of constitutional violations and various other crimes, and some of them are still in the courts. But on some that he has been sentenced, he's been excluded in standing for public office for 8 years. So he won't, if this holds, he won't contest the next elections. So one possible lineup is that you get a candidate of the center or of the right who is basically the candidate and who appeals to Bolsonaro's voters. Bolsonaro himself still hopes that Trump-like, he might escape these convictions and run again. But I think that the Brazilian Supreme Court on these issues has been harder line than the US Supreme Court, which has basically endorsed Trump's right to run again.
Now, Andrew, the two countries we were talking about there, their elections, these are still functioning democracies, whether they've swung from one extreme to the other or not. One country that probably is no longer a functioning democracy would be Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro claims he won another election in the past year. Nobody else really around the world, at least, will recognize that, or at least not in the West. Is that the end of it in Venezuela at this point? I mean, could anything have been done differently by international actors here? Could anything be done differently inside the country to revive Venezuelan democracy?
That's a really difficult question to answer because Maduro's opponents haven't quite tried everything, but they have tried lots of different things. They've tried to boycott elections. There've been small military uprisings. There's been taking part in elections, and Maduro seems to win every time. And part of that is that he's a wily politician. Part of it is that the ruling party controls everything, in a word. So it controls the presidency, it controls Congress, it controls the Supreme Court, which has never issued a ruling against the government. And he is very, very hard to get rid of. And here we are, we're looking at the beginning of the Trump presidency. When at the last Trump presidency, he announced that he would follow a policy of maximum pressure to force change in Venezuela, and it didn't happen. The Joe Biden presidency has tried a negotiated way out. We'll remove sanctions if you have a political opening, release political prisoners, and so on. And that hasn't worked either. So that would almost lead one to say the poor Venezuelans are stuck with Maduro forever. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the regime will eventually fall, but it's looking more like Bashar Assad in Syria, that it takes a decade or more, and that eventually the forces that are keeping Maduro in power, and in particular the army, may fragment and open a door towards a genuine democratic elections. But it's a long way to go, and it's been, everyone recognizes in the July election, the opposition candidate got about 70% of the vote, and Maduro got about 30%. But the government is just completely ignoring that, overriding it, and they say that on the 10th of January, Maduro will be re-inaugurated for another presidency.
Andrew Thompson, journalist and political risk analyst on Latin America, thank you very much for joining us. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
This is The Globalist, and if there is a region that has faced more upheaval than any other this year, it would have to be the Middle East. Conflicts in Lebanon and uprising in Syria, and yet at the center of it all has been Israel and its war in Gaza. For a look back at the year that's been, we're joined by Yossi Meckelberg, Monocle Radio regular and senior consulting fellow at Chatham House. Yossi, it is Christmas Eve, and of course Israel and the West Bank are at the heart of so much for all three of the world's major religions. So I wanted to kind of start there with you. What are these holidays like in the Holy Land at the moment?
Yes, the thing is the Holy Land, and you would expect, and it's felt a little bit unholy over the last 15 months. I can remember times that comes Christmas Eve, and dignitaries are descending on Bethlehem and Nazareth, whether it's the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem or the church in Nazareth of the Annunciation. Thousands of people, and it was broadcast live. Just because the celebration of Christmas, many times it takes around the time of Hanukkah, the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. So it adds to the festivities there.
Was there, in that sense, there had been a coming together moment also in that sense of, as you say, Hanukkah and Christmas for that matter?
As it is here, by the way. It's the first candle of Hanukkah is on Christmas Day. So if it's symbolic, it's interesting. But the idea that yes, that the three monotheistic religions there, where it's in the Holy Land, and the ability to celebrate together. And there were times you can drive to Bethlehem freely and not to think about security threats. And since the first Intifada and then the second Intifada, and in between there was the heydays of Oslo, that you saw the peace will come to the Middle East and the Israelis and Palestinians. And the last time I was in Bethlehem was actually 2019, just at the eve of Christmas, and Bethlehem, it's always beautifully decorated, but less people. And the other thing that we should mention is less Christians in the Holy Land than ever. Many left the Holy Land.
I did want to ask you about that. I mean, yes, Christians have been leaving Bethlehem and the Holy Land quite steadily over the past few decades, but even more so, I suppose, in the past few years. I mean, is there still a place for Christians in the region?
And there should be. I think the one among many other things, one of the sad things, the Middle East, for many centuries was known actually for tolerance. and even under the Ottoman Empire, of tolerance of different religions. As long as you pay taxes, as long as you didn't rebel against the Ottoman Empire, you could practice whatever religion, whatever beliefs you had. And this changed. And the extremism, fundamentalism on all sides has a huge impact. And right now, in the West Bank, not everyone can travel on all roads. Palestinians are not allowed to travel on roads, for instance, that settlers are there, the checkpoints. So this is not the same West Bank. This is not the same Holy Land that we experienced 30 and 40 years ago. And the question where it all comes to an end, that all three monotheistic religions will be able to celebrate all the festivals together and share. It doesn't look like this at the moment.
What was Bethlehem like back in 2019 when you visited? What do you remember from that?
On the one hand, you had the lights and the decorations, and next to the Church of Nativity, it's always beautiful, but you don't have the number of people in the main square that you would expect to see. And the same, you go, still beautiful, wonderful restaurants with great food as you would expect, but they're half empty, if not more. And when you go down, it's not only in Bethlehem, it's in the market in Jerusalem. I've been more recently there. It's just you walk down the market and it's empty, and you talk to the merchants in the market and say, we need to, for us, war and conflict is the end of our, economically, it destroys us. We are not interested in the politics, all of that. We like to see people from everywhere in the world either come to Haram el-Sharif or come to the Wailing Wall or visiting the churches, and then there is economic activity, and there is a different feel. Actually, walking last time, which was in September, down the market in Jerusalem, was very sad because it was nearly empty. Most of the shops closed.
Is there some hope, I suppose, in Israel? I mean, what's the mood at this time of year, this time around? I mean, last year, certainly the mood will have been extremely raw, given the October 7th attacks. After the year that we've had, one could make an argument for better or worse that Israel has achieved a lot of its aims in this last year. I mean, do you get any sense that, sort of looking forward to 2025, what is the mood of people in Israel?
It's a good question. I think it's still a society that suffers from a trauma. It's a society that lives in willful ignorance about what happens in Gaza. They don't want to know. You close Al Jazeera. You try to punish the free press, boycotting one of the most progressive newspapers, Haaretz. So you don't want to know what happens there. But I think at one point or another, they will have actually to see what Israel inflicted on the Gazan people. The same time in the West Bank, there is ongoing on much lower intensity conflict, but it's there too. But I think one of the things is about the hostages. And you know that it took so long to negotiate the release of the hostages and ongoing negotiations on this, when hundreds, we don't know how many of them are alive, but even those who are alive go through terrible suffering, and we are still going through entire 2024, until Christmas Eve, with not knowing what happened to the hostages. And you don't see what is lacking is hope, belief that can get out of it. Because if you look at the conversation beyond the war, it's about security. It's about how October 7, rightly so, doesn't happen again. But they don't talk about coexistence. They don't speak about reconciliation. The word peace is barely mentioned. And at the end of the day, only peace, coexistence, reconciliation can secure for everyone, Palestinians and Israelis alike, security in the long term. But this is not the discourse.
Well, to that point then, Yossi, I mean, this is quite a pessimistic conversation, to be honest. And I do wonder, just when you talk about that pivot, I suppose, from security to reconciliation, is there a point you can imagine that happening? What needs to happen in order for us to reach that point again where maybe these three religions can coexist as well?
I would argue optimism and pessimism is a state of mind. It's not a policy. So we are entitled some days to be more pessimistic and other days more optimistic. But it's how we make optimism win.
How we create optimism.
Exactly. So how we move, and it's as much a change of the mindset, the dealing with the thing on the ground. Because at the end of the day, fear is an emotion. It stems from something. It's not imaginary because there are threats there. But if you start to build relation with the other side and understand that the other side feels as insecure, if sometimes not more insecure than you can start a dialogue about that. The problem definitely since the Second Intifada, Israelis, Jewish Israelis, and Palestinians don't talk to each other. There are walls, there are fences, there are checkpoints. But dialogue, grassroots dialogues barely exist. One side thinks it's normalization, the other side they say there is no point there, talking about not having partner. At the end of the day, until there is a recognition that both people are going to live there and they have no other choice, or the choice is between a conflict and what we have seen in the last 14, 15 months, which I hope the majority doesn't want this to continue, or to start moving away from it and be creative about how this land is shared between the people. And then you can be as creative as you like. There is not only one way to share this piece of land. It's a small piece of land. You can think about different modalities of a two-state solution. But the most important thing is to come from the principled position, the values of equality of human rights, of political rights, of civil rights. Then you can change the discourse. So I think it's possible, but you need leadership, you need education, you need to, first and foremost, to end the war and then start to looking into plans to do that.
Yossi Meckelberg of Chatham House, thank you very much for joining us on this special edition of The Globalist. That's all the time we have for today's program. Thanks to our producer, Hassan Anderson, our researcher, Maisie Ringer, our studio manager, Elliot Greenfield, with editing assistance from Flynn Simons. There is more festive holiday music on the way. The briefing is coming up at midday in London. The Globalist will be here at the same time tomorrow. I'm Chris Cermak. Thanks for tuning in, and happy holidays, everyone.